There are evenings in Oxford when even the rain seems scholarly, hesitant, deliberate, unwilling to rush its descent upon the old stones. That night it came in fine threads across the quad, wrapping the lamps in a kind of monastic hush. I had wandered there without purpose, or perhaps with the sort of purpose that only solitude knows. The air smelled faintly of wet leather and something older glue, parchment, the ghosts of vanished hands that had once turned pages by candlelight. It was the Bindery that drew me, though I can't quite explain why. I'd passed it hundreds of times, a narrow annex tucked behind the Bodleian, its windows dulled by decades of dust. The sign above the door, Department of Restoration and Binding, seemed at once pretentious and modest, like much of Oxford itself. Inside, faint light spilled from a half-open door, and with it came the soft whir of a polishing cloth, the tap of some unseen tool. The porter at the gate had mentioned Dr. Quentin Latham in passing, a bibliographer of some repute, he'd said, though repute is an unreliable companion in academic life. Latham had not been seen since evensong the previous evening. I remember nodding absently, pretending it was idle gossip, but curiosity, like ink, has a way of seeping through every layer of indifference. When I stepped closer, a draught carried out a single, unbound folio, fluttering like a white bird at my feet. I picked it up. Latin verse, neatly ruled margins, a faint stain of red wax along the edge. Someone had taken great care to make it beautiful, which is usually a prelude to something ruined. Inside, the Bindery was deserted. The benches were lined with spools of linen thread, narrow brushes, and tiny vials of gold pigment. Dust hung in the air, catching the lamplight like a visible silence. I ran a hand across a stack of calfskin bindings, one brown, one faded to a colour I could only call resignation. It struck me then how similar books and lives are both so easily unstitched. A movement caught my eye, a figure in an apron, stooped over a table at the far end. He straightened when I spoke, a young man, or perhaps a woman, hard to tell in that dim amber glow. The voice that answered was soft, almost apologetic. The doctor wasn't in, they said. Hadn't been since last night. Some small accident, perhaps. People lose themselves in their work here. Time frays at the edges like old cloth. I thanked them, though I hardly knew why. The words seemed to fall into the stillness and disappear, absorbed by paper and dust. I lingered a little longer, studying the tools of a craft that deals in repair and wondering, as I often did, how much in life could truly be mended once torn. When I finally stepped outside, the rain had thickened into mist. The folio still rested in my coat pocket, its edges slightly damp now, its words ghosting through the page in faint reverse. I should have returned it then, but something instinct, superstition, call it what you like, made me hold on to it. At the edge of the quad I turned back once more. Through the Bindery's window, the apprentice's shadow moved across the wall, small and deliberate, like a confession written in candlelight. And just for an instant, I thought I saw another shape beyond someone seated, unmoving, as though listening. I told myself it was imagination, that Oxford at night plays tricks upon the mind. Yet even as I walked away, I could still smell the dust of old paper on my hands, and it felt less like dust and more like the beginning of something I would never entirely understand. Morning came reluctantly, as if Oxford herself disapproved of daylight intruding upon what the night had concealed. I found myself once more before the Bindery, its narrow doorway glistening with a faint residue of mist. Inside, the lamps had been lit early. Their yellow halos made the air appear thick, like varnish left too long upon the brush. Lewis was there already, speaking quietly with a constable whose notebook seemed too clean for the place. Beyond them, at the long oak bench, lay Dr. Quentin Latham. His face, though untouched by violence, possessed the pallor of someone surprised by eternity. The apron of the young apprentice, Clara, I recalled her name now, was streaked with paste and something darker, perhaps ink, perhaps grief. She stood rigid, arms folded tightly across her chest, as if to keep the silence from entering her. There was little in the room to suggest struggle. A chair had been pushed back, a pen rolled near the floor, and on the table before him a sheet of paper, half written, half erased. I leaned closer. It was not a note of despair, but a crossword, unfinished. A faint line drawn diagonally through one clue caught my attention. 7 down a word for what cannot be restored. The answer space remained empty. I folded the paper discreetly into my pocket, feeling the faintest tug of curiosity, the kind that begins small and ends with entire nights lost to thought. Lewis muttered that the doctor had likely collapsed. The coroner would decide soon enough, he said. But something in the posture of the body disagreed with that tidy assumption. Latham's right hand hung over the edge of the table, palm open, as though reaching toward an invisible last line. Yet there was ink on the fingers, deep black, though no fountain pen lay near. I have always distrusted symmetry where the world presents it too perfectly. One must look for deceit. I asked the apprentice how she had found him. She hesitated, eyes lowered. She had come in early, she said, to finish a repair Latham had begun. He had been alone last night, working late as usual. The others had gone after the bell. She had knocked, no reply, then seen the light still burning. Her voice trembled at the memory. I asked if he'd complained of illness. She shook her head. He'd seemed distracted, yes, but he always was the sort of man, she said, who could forget dinner but never a comma. I studied her gloved hands as she spoke fine linen, though one finger was stained faintly blue. She noticed my glance and removed them, too quickly perhaps, folding them into her pocket. A simple nervous habit or something more. It's strange how often people incriminate themselves merely by trying to appear untroubled. A constable asked whether anything was missing. She gestured toward the table. The folio of Tristia, the one he'd been restoring, remained open under a glass weight. A ribbon marked the page, the Latin text gleamed faintly in the lamplight. I traced a finger along the margin and saw where the binding thread had been cut and resewn. It was delicate work, but the stitches were uneven, not the doctor's hand. Later, as Lewis arranged for the body's removal, I lingered by the window. Across the courtyard, students hurried past with umbrellas like black blossoms. The sound of rain upon the panes formed a rhythm that might have been mistaken for music. I thought then of how knowledge, too, could kill not by malice, but by the slow corrosion of solitude. Before leaving, I took one last look at the bench. A small glass stood beside the blotter, half filled with water, though its surface had grown milky overnight. The smell of claret lingered beneath it, faint, suggestive. I told Lewis to send it for analysis, though I half expected it would reveal nothing. Outside, the rain had steadied into a fine mist. I paused beneath the eaves, lighting a cigarette I didn't particularly want. The smoke curled upward, and in it I saw, absurdly, the faint outline of the man in the apron, and behind him something even fainter, a question waiting to be bound. I have never trusted rooms that smell too strongly of polish. The Bindery's adjoining office was one of those mahogany desks gleaming with a sort of aggressive respectability, the faint tang of beeswax masking what must have been decades of human disappointment. Lewis stood near the door, notebook in hand, while I faced the small congregation of Oxford's learned and weary. Professor Mordaunt sat with the impatience of a man whose intellect had outlived his courtesy. He was all sharpness, cheekbones, vowels, opinions, each honed to a point. Clara Hale, the apprentice, hovered at the edge of the gathering, her pale hands folded like someone awaiting judgment. Father Desmond Quinn, the chaplain, wore the expression of a man perpetually forgiving sins he privately enjoyed cataloguing. Between them there lay a web of glances, small and telling Mordaunt's disdain, Quinn's guarded sympathy, Clara's quiet defiance. Oxford in miniature. I asked when they had last seen Latham. Mordaunt answered first, his tone polished to irritation. The man was obsessive, he said, the sort who would correct the index of a Bible. He muttered that Latham had no imagination, by which he meant, of course, that Latham had discovered something Mordaunt wished to claim. Clara spoke next, softly, saying that Latham had been kind but distracted of late, muttering about missing pages and misfiled codices. I watched her eyes as she said it. They flickered not toward me, but toward the chaplain, who responded with the stillness of guilt disguised as compassion. I remarked that Latham's work on the Wycliffe papers had stirred some debate. Mordaunt scoffed. The Wycliffe manuscripts, he said, were scholarly fool's gold, half heresy, half invention. I noted, however, how his hand trembled slightly when he reached for his spectacles. People often reveal their truths by what they choose to mock. Quinn interjected then, quoting lightly from Milton about the blindness of knowledge. His voice was low and well-trained, the sort that can make deceit sound devotional. I asked if the college owned the manuscripts or merely guarded them. His reply was evasive. The Church, he said, has always been custodian of the written word. He smiled, but not with his eyes. There was a pause, then the sort of silence Oxford does particularly well. I filled it by glancing at the desk before me. 3 glasses stood there, recently washed, though only 2 had been used. A faint ring of claret remained on one. I remembered the same scent from the Bindery the previous night, faint but persistent. A man's habits are the most eloquent witnesses. Lewis shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the tension that scholarship produces when it curdles into rivalry. I asked him to make a note about the glasses, though I doubted the importance of the instructions. It was not the glass that mattered, but who had washed it. As we left, Mordaunt muttered something about Latham's private delusions, his tone too casual to convince. Outside, the corridor was lined with portraits of scholars whose eyes seemed to follow one's retreat. I paused before one Elizabethan don, painted with a quill in hand. The Latin beneath read Sapientia et Silentium, wisdom and silence. I found myself murmuring that the two are seldom companions. Lewis asked if I believed them. I said that belief was an extravagance I could no longer afford. What I believed in were the small things. The folded gloves of a nervous apprentice, the wrong quotation from a priest, the residue of wine upon a polished glass. Later, walking back through the drizzle, I thought of Latham's crossword, still in my pocket. The clue had begun to stir again in my mind, a word for what cannot be restored. I tried a dozen answers as the rain fell across the cobbles, but none seemed right. Oxford is full of such puzzle lives, half solved, half erased, bound together by the thread of secrecy and the dust of old paper. The morning light in Oxford has a way of arriving without enthusiasm, diffused through the college mist, as if reluctant to reveal what the night has done. I stood once more inside the Bindery, its windows clouded with condensation, the air heavy with the odour of glue and decay. The doctor's body had been taken away by then, but the impression of him lingered, his half-open eyes staring from the grain of the table, the faint outline of his elbow on the varnish. Death leaves such small annotations. The folio lay where it had been found, opened upon the bench like an accusation. the Tristia of Ovid, bound in tooled leather, its spine cracked where hands had turned it too often. Lewis watched me as I drew a gloved finger down the margin. The parchment rasped faintly, dry as winter breath. There was a smudge near the bottom, the faintest darkening where ink had once been and then not. He said the pathologist had confirmed poison was something slow, ingested, almost gentle in its cruelty. I nodded, though the word gentle sat wrong in the air. The report had said he'd likely poured himself a final glass of claret, unaware it was his last. I looked toward the workbench again. The glass had been cleared away. That, too, was curious. Lewis was speaking about fingerprints, but I heard only the clock ticking above the doorway. Each sound measured something more than time. It measured patience, guilt, and evasion. I turned back to the folio. Ovid's lament stared up at me. Forsitan et nostrum nomen fara venit. Perhaps even my name will be known. I wondered what Latham had wanted his name to mean. A magnifying lens rested beside the open volume. I used it, not for what it showed, but for what it failed to hide. There, along the lower edge of the flyleaf, the binding had been disturbed. The thread was newly waxed, its colour subtly paler than the rest. Someone had replaced a section of the folio. Rebinding is a delicate art, and this was clumsy, hurried. Latham would never have tolerated such unevenness. Lewis asked if it meant anything. I said it might. He raised an eyebrow, the sort of look that demands translation, so I added that forgery and faith often share a parentage, both rely upon belief. He laughed softly, unsure if it was meant as humour. We searched the shelves for related works. Most were unremarkable: Latin sermons, annotated editions of Dante, a battered copy of Paradiso, whose margins were filled with what I could only call loneliness. Then in a small locked cabinet, Lewis found a folder marked Wycliffe Papers, Private Collation. Inside, fragments of manuscript, each numbered in Latham's careful hand. One page, however, was missing. The list jumped from 23 to 25. The thought came uninvited. Perhaps he had found something the college preferred to misplace. Theology, when mixed with pride, produces poisons no chemist can trace. I pocketed a note Latham had made in pencil along the back of one fragment, just a phrase, lux per errorem intravit. The light entered through error. It struck me that he had been writing about more than translation. As we left, I paused at the door and looked back at the bench. A small pool of light gathered on the surface from the high window, illuminating the empty space where the folio had lain. The dust around it formed a faint rectangular shadow, as though the book still resisted being gone. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began their slow tolling. I could almost hear Latham's voice within them, measured, fastidious, asking once more for accuracy in a world that preferred ease. I told Lewis we would need to visit the chaplain next. The forgery was too carefully concealed to be born of ignorance. He asked what I hoped to find. I told him I wasn't sure. Perhaps a mistake, or perhaps something worse than perfection. It was raining again, though the kind of rain that Oxford seems to breed, especially for itself, is discreet, persistent, unwilling to admit it exists. The city has a way of dressing its sadness in manners. I walked to Walton Street under that soft drizzle, thinking not of theology or manuscripts, but of a pair of hands. They were small, pale, and clumsy when nervous. I had seen them tremble slightly as they folded linen gloves into a coat pocket. One glove torn at the fingertip, mended hastily with red thread. Clara Hale lived in rooms above a picture framer's shop, the kind that smells perpetually of varnish and dust. When she opened the door, her face carried that half-startled look peculiar to those who expect blame. I told her she wasn't under suspicion. She said she knew, though her voice wavered as if trying to convince itself. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of boiled tea and turpentine. Books lay stacked unevenly on the mantel, a violin without strings leaning against the wall. She poured tea without asking whether I wanted any. The gesture felt rehearsed, a way of occupying silence. I noticed the gloves again, draped over a chair to dry, the repaired finger catching the lamplight like a wound that refused discretion. She spoke of Latham as one might speak of a stern parent with gratitude that masks fear. He was kind, she said, but impatient with ignorance. He'd been troubled these last weeks, obsessed with a missing folio. Sometimes he worked through the night, muttering to himself. Once he told her that a single page could damn a man if read incorrectly. I asked what he meant. She looked toward the window where the rain gathered in thin silver lines. He was worried about Father Quinn, she said after a pause. There'd been words between them about the Wycliffe manuscript. Something about faith or fraud. She didn't know which word fit better. It was then I noticed the faint mark on her wrist, a smudge the colour of old ink, half scrubbed away. I asked if she'd been in the bindery after hours. She shook her head too quickly. The denial arrived before the question had finished breathing. I told her I'd seen careful hands in the forgery's stitching, hands that knew thread as others know sin. The red mending on the glove was neat work. She looked down at them, then smiled faintly, an exhausted sort of smile. I repair what's broken, she said. It's all I've ever done. There was a small fire in the grate. The logs hissed, as though protesting their own dissolution. On the mantel stood a photograph of her mother. I recognized the eyes, the same shade of hesitant blue. A binder once, Clara said softly, before her hands began to shake. She'd worked for the college long ago. Father Quinn knew her well. The deduction came without warning, as they often do, not as lightning, but as a slow inward glow. The red thread, the steady hands, the knowledge of restoration passed down like a family heirloom. The connection between the chaplain and the apprentice was not professional. It was inherited. I asked whether Latham had threatened anyone. She hesitated, then whispered that he'd discovered something on a page he wasn't meant to read. He'd told her it changed everything, though he never said what everything was. The next morning, he was dead. When I left, she offered to walk me to the stairs. Her gloves were back on her hands, hiding the ink, concealing the tremor. At the door, I turned and asked one last question, whether she believed in redemption. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Not for those who bind lies into Scripture," she said quietly. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the street still shone like glass. I stood there for a while, the image of that red thread winding through my thoughts, binding together things that had long since come apart. Evening has its own liturgy in Oxford. Bells converse across the roof's footsteps, echo beneath the arches like unanswered prayers. That night, the air tasted faintly of incense and rain. Lewis and I walked towards St. Anselm's Chapel, where the choir was rehearsing the Miserere. It drifted through the cloisters like something half-remembered from a dream penitence-given melody. I have always distrusted perfection in music. It hides pain too efficiently. The boys' voices rose and fell in faultless symmetry, and beneath that beauty I felt a tremor, the faint discord that often accompanies deceit. Father Quinn was waiting in the nave, hands clasped behind his back. He greeted us with the calm of a man accustomed to confession, though not necessarily to truth. He spoke of Latham in the past tense already, the way priests often speak of the living when they've made peace with their death. His eyes drifted toward the organ loft as he spoke, avoiding mine. He said the college mourned a scholar, not a friend. Latham's brilliance had come at the expense of warmth. The chaplain's tone was elegiac, but his choice of words was too precise, too rehearsed. I asked if he'd seen Latham recently. He said yes, on the afternoon before his death. They discussed the Wycliffe papers, or, as he called them, that theological vanity. When he said it, I caught the faintest shadow of a smile. The choir reached the line, amplius lava me ab iniquitate me, wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity. The Latin clung to the stone walls. I found myself listening less to the meaning than to the rhythm, repetition, penance, concealment. I asked Quinn if he believed in divine forgiveness. He replied that faith and forgiveness were not synonymous. Then, after a pause, he quoted Milton. They also serve who only stand and wait. He delivered it with the assurance of memory, but misquoted slightly. They too serve who stand and wait. A small slip, barely noticeable, but it clung to me like the echo of a wrong note. Lewis later said I was being pedantic. Perhaps I was. But language, like crime, rarely errs without motive. After the choir was dismissed, Quinn led us through a narrow passage beneath the chapel. The crypt smelled of damp limestone and oil. He said Latham had once catalogued the manuscripts stored there, psalters, Latin fragments, devotional treatises too fragile for daylight. His voice softened as he gestured toward the alcoves. He called them the lungs of the college. I noticed his hands trembling slightly, though whether from cold or conscience I couldn't tell. One shelf was empty, a gap where dust had gathered in a clean rectangle. I brushed a finger across it and found a thread of red binding silk, perhaps. The same colour as the repair on Clara Hale's glove. The connection was too precise to dismiss. I asked Quinn who had access. He said only he and the Bindery staff. When we emerged, the choir had gone. The chapel was dim but still alive with the residue of sound. Quinn stood before the altar, his head bowed. I asked him whether he believed Latham's death was an accident. His reply came softly. Some scholars died for truth, others for their idea of it. Then he turned, and for a moment I thought I saw fatigue etched deeper than faith across his face. Outside, the rain had begun again. The stones glistened under the lamps. I lingered by the chapel gate, listening to the bells of All Souls striking 8. Their rhythm recalled the misquoted Milton. They, too, serve who stand and wait. The addition of that small word changed everything, just as the addition of a page can alter the meaning of a book. I remember thinking then that theology, like murder, often begins with a single misplaced word. There are moments in an investigation when silence becomes the only witness left. That evening the city had grown unusually still. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the towers of St. John's, and the cobbles glistened like polished stone in the faint lamplight. I found myself back in Latham's rooms, that curious blend of austerity and obsession, a scholar's cell decorated with the detritus of a restless mind. The smell of paper lingered, the faint sweetness of old claret clung to the air. Lewis was there before me, sifting through the doctor's notes with the careful reverence of someone who still believes knowledge is tidy. He said there was a letter half-written found beneath a stack of lecture drafts. It wasn't addressed. He handed it to me without comment. The writing began confidently, then faltered halfway through a line, as though its author had thought better of candour. The words were few, but weighted. To the warden the matter cannot remain buried. Truth demands, and then nothing, only the faint indentation of a quill pressed too hard. The ink had pooled at the edge of the page, forming a tiny, dark tear. I wondered if his hand had trembled then, or if the hesitation had been intellectual, the paralysis that seizes those who discover too much. Lewis remarked that the blot matched the one on the table near the wine-glass. He said it was a coincidence, but I have never liked that word. Coincidence is the refuge of the incurious. I took the letter, folded it carefully, and slid it into my pocket. The room was lined with books arranged not alphabetically but by intimacy. Marginalia everywhere, small wars fought in pencil. A volume of Ovid sat open near the window, its Latin underlined tempus edax rerum. Time, devourer of all things. It seemed a fitting epitaph. I poured what remained in the claret bottle into a glass. The residue caught the light darker, thicker than it should have been. Lewis frowned but said nothing. I thought of Latham's ritual, a single glass at night, a crossword beside it, silence as company. There had been no struggle because the weapon had been civility itself. A photograph lay on the desk of a group of scholars, the Bindery staff among them. Clara stood in the corner, her expression unreadable. Behind her, Father Quinn's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, the gesture of familiarity too instinctive to be purely paternal. I studied it for a long while. In the background, a blackboard half erased displayed a fragment of Latin verse. The visible words, veritas non in tenebris mane. Truth does not dwell in darkness. The irony was almost deliberate. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something small on the floor near the hearth, the corner of an envelope singed along one edge. The handwriting on it matched the letters, though the ink had blurred with heat. Inside was a single scrap torn from the Wycliffe manuscript, the words rendered almost illegible by smoke. Only one phrase survived per gratiam mendatiae, by the grace of a lie. Lewis asked if I thought the doctor had meant to post the letter. I said no. Men like Latham rarely send the truth. They only write it to prove it once existed. Later, walking back through the quad, I thought of the crossword again, as a word for what cannot be restored. Perhaps the answer wasn't a word at all, but an act withheld, a letter never sent, a confession left unsaid. When I reached home, I unfolded the letter again under the weak lamplight. The ink shimmered faintly, still damp in places despite the days past. It struck me then that words, once written, have a kind of half-life, neither living nor dead, waiting for someone foolish enough to read them. I set it down beside my whiskey glass and watched the rain against the window, thinking that Oxford too was a letter addressed to no one, written by everyone, and always left unfinished. Some nights arrive already burdened by the weight of what they're about to reveal. That evening Oxford's rain returned, soft, persistent, like a whispering conscience. I walked along Parks Road with the letter in my pocket, and the uneasy conviction that language, not poison, had killed Quentin Latham. Lewis was waiting in the car, restless, tapping the steering wheel with the rhythm of a man who disliked unsolved things. He asked whether we were any closer. I told him closeness was an illusion. The nearer one draws to truth, the less shape it seems to have. He muttered something about word games, which amused me more than it should have. At home, I spread the papers across my desk. The crossword still lay folded in its habitual quarter, its half-finished pattern of black and white squares staring up like a confession. 7 down binding promises, broken 4 letters. I'd read it a dozen times before, but the phrasing caught me differently now. Broken promise, a vow, perhaps. But there was something deliberate in the clue's symmetry, the neatness of its deceit. I circled it once more, then wrote the word beside it, vow. The next morning I took the photograph of the Bindery staff from my drawer, the one found in Latham's room. For the first time I noticed something absurdly ordinary, the chaplain's hand resting not upon Clara's shoulder, as I'd thought, but upon her mother's. Clara had been cropped from the original when the picture was reprinted for college records. The faint border of scissors was visible beneath the gloss. Someone had wished the past away. I carried the photograph to St. Anselm's. Father Quinn was alone in his office, surrounded by the quiet smell of candle wax and paper. He greeted me with a civility so polished it seemed almost tired. I asked him about the choir rehearsal. He said they were preparing for the feast of St. Jerome. He recited a verse from the Psalter, then paused, waiting for my approval. I told him that Latham had admired Jerome too, though perhaps not for his piety. The saint had once said, "A wrong translation is a lie told twice." Quinn smiled thinly. He said scholars often mistake accuracy for truth. It was a small exchange, forgettable to anyone but me. That phrase, mistake accuracy for truth, echoed faintly against something Latham had written in his Margin Lux per errorem intravit. The light entered through error. Their minds had shared a secret correspondence. I asked if he'd ever assisted Latham in editing manuscripts. His hands folded together, the way the devout do before a dangerous thought. He said he'd advised him on a few theological ambiguities. I asked whether those ambiguities included the missing page from the Wycliffe collection. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me, toward the crucifix above his desk. Then he said softly that some truths require a mission, that to preserve faith, one must sometimes alter the text. There it was, not confession but justification, the poison, the forgery, the silence, all of it bound together by the same conviction that correction was holiness. Before leaving, I thanked him and mentioned Milton again. I said I'd been thinking of his misquotation. They too serve who stand and wait. He smiled as if at a shared memory. A trivial slip, he said. I shook my head. Not trivial. You'd removed a word, Father. Milton wrote they also serve who only stand and wait. Remove only, and you change everything. You turn humility into purpose. For a moment his expression faltered, and I saw the ghost of the man he might once have been, one who believed every word could be saved if bent gently enough. Outside the rain had thinned into mist. I lit a cigarette beneath the chapel archway and watched the smoke drift upward, fragile, undecided. Words, I thought, are like tools for hiding or revealing, depending on who breathes them. And somewhere in that fragile space between the two, Quentin Latham had met his end. It is always the faintest light that betrays the dark. That evening, the Bindery was closed to everyone but ghosts, and I had long since learned to walk among them without fear. The corridor smelled faintly of wax and soot. Somewhere, a clock struck 9, the hour when Oxford began to remember its sins. Lewis had gone to fetch the keys, leaving me alone in the workshop. I could hear the rain ticking against the skylight, a steady pulse like breath through the lungs of the old building. The tables were empty, but the dust was restless. In the far corner, a wastebasket smouldered gently, sending up a thin, twisting plume of smoke. I moved toward it, careful not to disturb the air. The fire had not long begun. The paper at the top was blackened, curling into itself like petals in retreat. Beneath the ash lay what looked like parchment, old, brittle, the ink just visible through the char. I reached in with the tongs from the bench and lifted one fragment free. Only a few words had survived et lux in tenebris non lucet. The light does not shine in darkness. The phrase, of course, was wrong. The gospel reads lucet, shines. But this one had been deliberately altered non lucet. The light does not shine. Negation by faith or heresy by love. Either way, someone had written it to be hidden and then tried to burn the evidence of their own correction. Lewis returned, the door creaking behind him. He frowned at the smoke. "Someone's been careless," he said. I told him carelessness rarely burns so precisely. I handed him the scrap, watching his brow furrow. He said he'd seen that handwriting before, though he couldn't place where. I could. It was Quin's, neat and devout, the hand of a man who had spent his life translating between what was true and what was tolerable. We doused the embers with a jug of water from the sink. The hiss that followed was almost apologetic. The smell of burnt vellum lingered sharp, animal, wholly in its way. I thought of Latham again, his hands ink-stained, his life spent mending the thoughts of others. He had found this text the false line, the deliberate inversion, and perhaps had understood what it meant. Perhaps he had understood too well. On the desk beside the basket lay a sheaf of notes half consumed by smoke. One bore a heading in Latham's hand, anomaly, in transcription deliberate revision. His final annotation, just visible beneath the scorch, read, Quin involved, concealment spiritual, not scholarly. Lewis muttered that it was enough to call for questioning. I told him, not yet. Knowledge, like poison, requires careful dilution. As we left, I glanced once more at the bin. The ashes had settled into faint, concentric circles, like the rings left by a chalice. The centre was untouched by a single ember, breathing softly, unwilling to die. I stamped it out with my heel. Even light, I thought, must learn when to end. Outside, the chapel bells were tolling Compline. Quin would be there, kneeling among the choir, his voice lifted in penitence. I could almost hear it in the distance, steady, flawless, and false. Later that night, in my flat, I placed the fragment on my desk beside the crossword. Binding promise broken. The clue had returned, hauntingly apt. The answer still fits. Vow. I poured a whiskey and watched the reflection of the fire in the glass. Some promises, I thought, are not broken by betrayal, but by the silence of one man rewriting the word of another, of a scholar too proud to forgive, of a priest too frightened to repent. When I closed my eyes, I could still see the parchment burning not as evidence, but as absolution denied. There are truths one discovers not through logic, but through exhaustion. I remember the morning when the rain had finally stopped, and the city, washed of its sins, looked almost innocent again. The quadrangle shimmered faintly beneath the pale sunlight, the puddles reflecting the chapel spire like a conscience revisiting its memory. I had not slept. Some revelations, like guilt, arrive at dawn. Lewis was waiting outside the bindery, coat-collar raised, expression uncertain. He told me Mordaunt had come forward, unprompted, insisting he'd supplied the wine to Latham as a gesture of goodwill. A peace offering, he'd called it. I asked Lewis what sort of peace requires vintage Bordeaux. He shrugged the kind Oxford drinks when words fail. We went to Mordaunt's rooms. The Don was pacing, nervous and yet somehow rehearsed, the way a man prepares for forgiveness before being asked for it. He said the wine had been from his own cellar, an old bottle he'd intended as reconciliation. Latham had accused him of scholarly theft, and he had wished, he claimed, to end their feud. He repeated that he'd poured it himself, then left. I watched his hands as he spoke, steady, precise, the same hands that might forge a signature without trembling. On the mantel stood another bottle from the same case, unopened. I took it up and studied the cork. Dust at the neck, faint residue of wax. But the label was wrong, the crest mismatched by a shade of blue. A small detail, unremarkable to most. To a binder, though, to a man who notices threads, it was the difference between truth and imitation. Mordaunt noticed my silence. He said it had been a gift, perhaps relabelled at the merchant's. His voice thinned on the word perhaps. I told him we'd check. He smiled faintly, as though grateful for the ritual of investigating the illusion that guilt might be sorted, catalogued, shelved. Later, back at the chapel, I found Quinn alone by the altar, extinguishing the candles. He looked smaller without the choir, diminished by quiet. He asked if it was over. I said it never was. The smoke from the candle drifted upward, veiling his face. He whispered that Clara had come to him after the death, frightened, repentant. She believed she had caused it by pouring the claret by mistake. I asked what he had told her. That God forgives all accidents, he said. But his tone faltered on the word accidents. The memory of the burned fragment returned to me then, et lux in tenebris non luce. The light does not shine in darkness. The deliberate inversion, Quinn's correction. He misquoted Milton, his entire life built upon the art of altering meaning so gently it still sounded holy. I told him the poison had been prepared long before Clara touched the bottle. It required timing, knowledge of ritual, knowing that Latham drank alone after evensong, never before. Only one who knew his devotions could have known the hour. Quinn's eyes closed briefly, a gesture less of denial than relief. He said he had only wished to protect the church from blasphemy, to preserve faith from corruption. Latham had found what was never meant to be read in his brother's heretical translation. I asked if Clara knew. He shook his head. She thought herself the sinner he'd let her. I told him she'd saved him once, years ago, mended his work, covered his shame, the red thread of her glove, the same used in the Bindery's sacred repair. He seemed to understand then that the mercy he'd sought had already been given, unasked. When I left, he remained kneeling by the altar. The light through the stained glass touched his face in fragments of faith broken into colour. I thought of Latham, of his crossword, folded neatly beside the poisoned glass. The final clue, a word for what cannot be restored. I still have it, that crossword. One square left blank. I never filled it. Some things are not meant to be completed. It rained again the day of the inquest, as if the heavens, too, preferred footnotes to verdicts. The court sat briefly, its solemnities half-hearted, its conclusions gentler than truth. Death by misadventure, the coroner had said, a phrase that tidied the unmanageable into paperwork. Oxford thrives on such euphemisms. The past becomes merely administrative. Lewis stood beside me in the corridor afterwards, uneasy, in the silence that follows resolution. He said it was finished now, that we'd done all we could. I told him there are cases that end without closure, like books whose final chapters have been misplaced. He smiled thinly, knowing it wasn't really an argument. Back in the Bindery, the air had already lost the scent of smoke. They'd opened the windows, and the light fell pale across the workbenches. Someone had stacked new leather bindings where the fire had eaten through the varnish. Life, I suppose, is Oxford's most persistent habit of restoration as denial. On the table lay the folio Latham had been mending when he died. The stain of claret had dried to a faint purple shadow, just visible against the cream of the parchment. It looked, oddly, like a bruised petal. I found myself tracing the margin where he'd once written in pencil, lux per errorum intravit. The light entered through error. Lewis asked what I meant to do with the papers we'd recovered, the letter, the fragment, the forged translation. I said they would be returned to the archives, sealed away under the usual heading private correspondence of no enduring academic value. He frowned, though he knew it was a kindness. The truth, when unmoored from love, is only cruelty in Latin. When he left, I stayed. The Bindery had grown quiet again, the sort of quiet that listens back. The rain beyond the window softened to drizzle, indistinguishable from the slow breathing of the city. For a moment I imagined the room as it had been that first night, the light low, the air thick with dust, the folio open like a confession awaiting translation. There are details that remain long after guilt has faded. The red thread of Clara's glove, the smudge on Latham's sleeve, the missing word in Quinn's sermon, each syllable in a language I will never quite master. Clara herself had vanished from Oxford soon after the funeral, a brief note to the college bursar, nothing more. I suspect she had found her own way toward mercy, an art rarer than scholarship. I poured a small measure of whisky and sat by the window. The crossword was still folded in my pocket, worn now along its creases. I unfolded it one last time. 7 down, a word for what cannot be restored. I had written vow there once, half in certainty, half in despair. But another word occurred to me now, one that suited the silence better. Mercy. I filled it in with deliberate care. The pencil left a faint indent, as though afraid of permanence. Outside, the rain had thinned into mist. The chapel bells began to ring for evensong, their sound less a summons than an echo of something already ended. I thought of Father Quinn in his cell, of Mordaunt lecturing once more on the frailty of truth, of Clara perhaps binding books in some quieter city where no one spoke Latin, and of Latham, whose final translation had been of life into meaning, meaning into dust. I closed the folio gently, aligning the edges, smoothing the spine. For all our learning, that is all we ever do, bind fragments against the inevitable loosening. When I left, I locked the door behind me and stood a while beneath the archway. The rain had stopped. The stones glistened faintly, each one holding the reflection of a different century. Somewhere, unseen, a bell tolled once more, and I thought of how every sound in Oxford seems to belong to the past. And then, for reasons I have never been able to explain, I turned back and whispered, "Forgive him," though I could no longer say to whom I meant it. It has been some weeks now since the Bindery reopened. Oxford has resumed its rituals, the bicycle bells at noon, the murmured Latin from half-open chapel doors, the sound of rain softening into routine. I sometimes walk past the building in the evenings when the lamps burn low and the smell of warmed leather drifts through the open window. It is a scent that refuses to fade, adhesive and animal history made tactile. Lewis says the case is finished. He's right, of course, in the bureaucratic sense. The files are closed, the evidence sealed, the college grateful for discretion. Yet endings in Oxford are a peculiar thing, never sharp, merely folded into other stories. Truth, like paper, can always be rebound. I saw Father Quinn once after the inquest walking across the quad in a coat too thin for the cold. He stopped when he noticed me, though whether from guilt or habit I couldn't tell. His eyes had lost their clerical composure. They looked lighter somehow, almost relieved. We spoke briefly, the kind of conversation that sounds like prayer but isn't. He said he would be leaving Oxford for a quieter parish in Devon. I wished him peace. It was, I think, the one thing he had never truly believed in. Of Clara I heard nothing. A note was left at the porter's lodge, courteous, unsigned, expressing gratitude for my kindness, which I found puzzling. Kindness had not been my contribution to her story. I imagine her somewhere inland, binding books no one will ever read, her hands still smelling faintly of glue and thread. I think of her sometimes when I pass the college library and hear the scrape of bindings on the shelf, that small, perfect friction of endings meeting beginnings. The Wycliffe manuscript, or what remains of it, lies now in the restricted collection. The missing page has not been replaced. The forgery sits quietly among the genuine. I argued half-heartedly that it should remain so, a flaw preserved like an act of mercy. The archivist disagreed, but Oxford rarely moves quickly when deciding how to remember itself. I have returned, intermittently, to Latham's crossword. It sits on my desk beneath a stack of neglected reports. The pencil lines have faded, the paper yellowed slightly, yet the unanswered clues still wait, obstinate in their silence. One of them reads a word for what lingers after meaning is lost. I've tried echo, faith, dust. None feel right. Perhaps there is no right answer. Perhaps that is the point. Sometimes, late at night, I pour a small measure of whiskey and listen to the rain against the window. The city changes under rain and becomes softer, less certain of its own cleverness. I think of Latham then, and of the folio, and of that small Latin correction that turned light into darkness. It is astonishing, really, how little is required to alter the world. One drop of poison, one word misplaced, one vow misremembered. The Bindery stands silent now, its new lamps shining on the varnished tables. They say time heals, I suspect it only repairs. The scar remains in the grain of the wood, the faint scorch near the wastebasket, the smell of burned parchment beneath the floorboards. There is comfort in such permanence. We need our reminders that knowledge, too, can wound. I sometimes imagine the doctor's last moment, the glass half empty, the ink on his fingers, the puzzle unfinished. He was a man undone, not by cruelty, but by precision, by his refusal to let error live. I understand that weakness. We share it. We who chase truth through corridors lined with books and ghosts. When I pass the bindery, I pause by the window. The air inside hums faintly as if still remembering its own destruction. The scent drifts outward, leather, dust, and something sweeter beneath. I breathe it in, half in habit, half in elegy. Oxford will forget this story as it forgets most things, but I will not. Some cases leave behind evidence. No file can contain a phrase, a gesture, a smell that refuses to leave your coat, the smell of leather and dust, the residue of words that tried once to mean something.